So I recorded the first two parts of this series from Hittites to Ataturks and the Republic one a while ago, like over a month or two ago, and I completely missed that there was a third part of the Turkish Century series, and this one's a new beginning, so now I'm scrambling to quickly do this. Yeah, so it's been a few months since I looked at the last two parts, though I was reading the comments and I was very surprised at all the revelations that came out about this YouTuber whose name I'm still afraid to say. But yeah, apparently there's a lot of politicalness and that this channel, you guys know I'm a history reaction channel. That's what I do. I watch historical films, shows, and YouTubers, and that this is apparently much more heavily political than it is historical in some aspects, as what a lot of people were telling me. So I was very surprised at the revelations that came out when I at these videos, and the potential biases that this YouTuber has that I was not aware of when I was recording the first two parts. So good to know now. Just as we're about to wrap it up, and I don't imagine I'll be coming back to this unless a lot of people recommend more videos from him. But yeah, I'm really interested in seeing, because this part's about Erdogan? Huh, is that how you pronounce it? Alright, so this video is apparently gonna feature him, which I got warnings about how some people may or may not. I mean, he's still around and active. That's the funny thing. Like, I usually avoid modern stuff on this channel because, quite frankly, there's a lot about politics and modern stuff that is easy to get heated over. Like, you won't expect me to cover the freaking Ukraine war and all that stuff, but yeah, so, but I kind of have no choice because we're kind of getting there, and I'm not really, I don't really like talking much about politics, especially modern ones, because again, if there's two topics that I know for a fact that will rile people up, it's one, religion, and two, politics. So I'm going to be very careful with this one, after learning what I've learned about this YouTuber, and learning and the fact that we're getting heavily political. I feel like the meme, when it's like Thanksgiving or something, and it's like that one relative is like, I promise not to get political, and then like 2 drinks later they're like ranting about politics. So I'm going to be very careful with this one, guys. I'm definitely feel like I'm gonna walk on eggshells and be very iffy about what I'm hearing now in terms of information from this YouTuber. So yeah, this might potentially be my most safe reaction I've ever looked at. So we should probably just get to it already. Oh boy, let's see how this goes. So if you want to watch the original video, the link is down in the description down below. And if you enjoy my content and want to help me out in any way, shape, or form, feel free to please like, comment, and subscribe. And yeah, let's just get to it, shall we? Without any further ado, let us watch the Turkish Century New Beginnings.
This video is part 3 of a 3-part series. You will find the links to the first 2 parts in the description.
I now call on the distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, His Excellency Mr. Dominique Galouzou de Villepin.
L'option de la guerre peut apparaître a priori la plus rapide. Mais n'oublions pas qu'après avoir gagné la guerre, il faut construire la paix. Et ne nous voilons pas la face. Cela sera long et difficile, car il faudra préserver l'unité de l'Irak, rétablir de manière durable la stabilité dans un pays et une région durement affectés par l'intrusion de la force.
Und wir verdanken den USA unsere Demokratie. Die USA sind unverzichtbar für Frieden und Stabilität, aber für Deutschland haben sie eine ganz besondere Bedeutung, weil wir uns von den Nazis nicht selbst befreit haben und weil wir unsere Demokratie ohne ihre Hilfe nicht aufgebaut hätten. Nur meine Generation hat dabei gelernt, you have to make the case. And to make a case in the democracy, you must convince by yourself. Excuse me, I'm not convinced. This is my problem. And I cannot go to the public and say, oh, well, let's go to war because there are reasons and so on, and I don't believe in that.
Fidèle à l'esprit de la Charte des Nations Unies, qui est notre loi commune, la France considère que le recours à la force est le dernier recours, quand toutes les autres options ont été épuisées. La position de la France est partagée par la grande majorité de la communauté internationale. Les derniers débats ont clairement montré que le Conseil de sécurité n'était pas disposé, dans les circonstances présentes, à cautionner une marche précipitée à la guerre.
Liebe Mitbürgerinnen und Mitbürger, die Welt steht am Vorabend eines Krieges. Meine Frage war und ist: Rechtfertigt das Ausmaß der Bedrohung, die von dem irakischen Diktator ausgeht, den Einsatz des Krieges, der Tausenden von unschuldigen Kindern, Frauen und Männern den sicheren Tod bringen wird? Meine Antwort in diesem Fall war und ist nein.
During the first years of the 21st century, when these Frees said no to the war in Iraq, it had a substantial impact on the politics of Europe. Many Europeans at first shunned them for making a supposedly wrong decision and betraying their allies. But as it increasingly turned out to be the correct decision, it called into doubt a fundamental structure of European politics. Since the end of the Second World War, Europe built, expanded, and saw itself as an economic zone focused on itself, with a goal of building and ensuring peace amongst themselves to avoid past catastrophes repeating themselves and to ensure prosperity amongst themselves. Foreign policies and interventions were left to the Americans, with the exception of France, who didn't like being told what to do, especially in Africa. The only time this arrangement had been seriously challenged was during the Vietnam War, which was the first and until 2003 only time that European democracies had publicly taken a stance against an American war. Iraq changed this. If America could get it so wrong and drag us into such a disaster, isn't a common foreign policy commitment to her more of a liability than anything else? France and Germany spearheaded something new as a result, the idea of a Europe as a democratic counterweight to the United States on the world stage, or at the very least that Europe no longer had to follow America's direction on the world stage. Someone completely opposed this, others were open to the war in Iraq until it turned worse and worse. But what we often tend to forget today is that one of the main partners amongst the nations that opposed this war in Iraq and thought of Europe in different and new terms was Turkey. But the waters are also a little more muddied than simply that. One of the main reasons for Turkey's opposition to the war in Iraq was that the previous war in Iraq had greatly damaged the Turkish economy for an internationally enforced embargo that cost the Turks between $80 billion and $100 billion. Additionally, remember all the military coups and purges throughout the last decades? After the end of the Cold War, it was increasingly revealed that almost all of these coups and purges had happened with the approval and even support of the United States. These revelations deeply soured the image of the United States within Turkey. Previously seen as an ally against communism and a partner in trade and modernization, the United States were now increasingly viewed as a sinister force, intervening behind the scenes against the will and the interests of the Turkish people. At the time, both France and Germany had leaderships who welcomed the idea of a Turkish EU membership, seeing her as a positive influence in creating a new European and democratic power bloc. And as the 2000s progressed, Turkey was courted more and more, even by the United States. It is these days overshadowed by current events, but the Erdogan we know today didn't have much in common with the Erdogan of the early 2000s. In the late 1990s, he had a substantial falling out with his mentor Necmettin Erbakan. Instead of rejoining him, he founded his own party and proclaimed to leave the old radical ways behind in favor for a more democratic Islamic conservative party. He found new allies within the Gülen movement. The people he wanted to court and build a new right wing around were the moderate Islamic conservatives, those successful conservative businessmen that developed throughout the 1980s. There would be no more demands for Sharia, no more challenges to the separation of religion and state. There was to be democratic consensus building and an acknowledgement of differing viewpoints and the opposition. New people came to surround Erdogan's movement, people like Ahmet Davutoglu and Abdullah Gül. Abdullah Gül in particular gives us great insights into what this redirection meant. Gül was raised by a conservative family, studied economics in London, and then worked for 8 years at a bank in Saudi Arabia. He would consequently be the first leading Turkish politician who spoke Arabic, but also spoke fluent English and understood European social and political dynamics. Their main goal would be to conduct social and economic reforms to elevate the country's status and to tie it economically and socially into Europe, but to also forge new ties and deeper ties into the Middle East. When we look at a map of Europe that Europeans are so familiar with, Turkey always seems to be down there in the corner, peeking out from down there at us. When we look at the map of the Middle East that so many of us are familiar with, Turkey always seems to be up there at the edge, peeking down at the rest. But move the map so that Turkey stands in the center, and you will notice how the...
You know, I've commented on this before, like around when we were covering a lot of the Byzantine Empire, is... You know, Rome was kind of the center of the world, because I often said that whatever came from the east would hit Rome first, and the forces of the west, usually trying to get to the east, would have to get to it. So Anatolia, I've had this fascination, and you'll see in future videos that I've made, like map videos that I've looked at, I have this weird fascination now for Anatolia and its rich history, from its various regime changes, from, you know, the Hittites to the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Turks, and it just a very rich place. And I always said that, like, yeah, it's basically the center where, you know, Europe goes on to, you know, the eastward. So I always found, like, the geography of it very important, and it's literally between two worlds. And yeah, I would often comment that in the Byzantine stuff, but it still is pretty relevant today. Like, I find it's where it's situated an incredibly unique and interesting place. It is interesting to hear about, you know, Turkey and some of the other nations involved with the US, because we have covered that the end of World War II, in which America took basically center stage as the power of one of the superpowers of the world alongside the USSR. And I think it's in the Suez Crisis video from Epic History that we covered, where that change of authority was very prevalent, where France and the UK tried to meddle in what was going on with, you know, in the Middle East, and then basically America with many other nations basically told them to back down, kind of shamed them, and they did. I think that was a pretty big indicator of how things were gonna go. And so it's interesting because, you know, even here in America, I can at least give you an American perspective, you know. We're pretty high on our success on World War II and very proud of it. And kind of seeing ourselves as kind of like the new face or the bastion of freedom and democracy and making the world better. And we're all aware of America's involvement in many other countries, which is a topic of debate among Americans if we should have, you know, like obviously with the proxy wars of the Cold War, like in Korea and Vietnam, and America combating communism, basically playing this chess game with the USSR. And it really does depend on who you're talking to in America. Some might say, well, you know, America had to do it. In the end, it was justified. And others will say a lot, no, probably America overstepped a lot. I've heard major opinions on both. And even, you know, it is known that, like with the Vietnam War, for instance, a lot of Americans protested the war. And did not even like what we were doing there, and it ended up as a kind of major L on our history. And what happened after 9/11 and the invasions of Iraq and then the wars of Afghanistan, there are even opinions where you'll hear Americans say that we shouldn't have done that, or that the pretext for taking Iraq, for example, wasn't justified. You even hear opinions of that from Americans here. Funny thing is, like a while ago, I was looking at it, and you guys may or may not know, I do like going on like history forums and like reading what people's thoughts and opinions are about certain topics, and I found my way into like these wars, and yeah, there were even like negative opinions from people, talking about it, and the Afghan situation, which ended back in 2021 with our withdrawal, many Americans viewing that as another failure, America getting involved in stuff. Obviously with these things, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of opinions. And so I find it interesting that Turkey was one of the few who, wasn't taking the lead, as it were, from America. Though, again, now I'm starting to question everything I'm hearing. Like, again, like, after reading the comments I got about, this YouTuber and some of his political ideology and a lot of people talking about biases, I'm now completely... The first two videos I reacted to, I didn't have all that information, and I was taking a lot of things at face value, because I usually go into these videos choosing to trust the YouTubers I'm looking at, whether it be kings or generals and whatnot. I try to, and when then I get like informed about the whatever's going on, and then now I'm kind of on alert mode, and like I'm not taking everything at face value anymore. Kind of like with the Historia Civilis is another big one. Like I like Historia Civilis, but whenever I watch his videos now, I'm on alert mode. I don't take everything at face value anymore. Because like I'm of the opinion, and this is just a me thing, that when you're making like historical-esque videos, it's best to be as unobjective as possible, you know what I mean? Because I do think, like, I'm not saying you can't have an opinion. Like, with Historia Civilis, for example, he hates Julius Caesar and Augustus, and that's fine. Like, you can have your opinion about history or whatnot, but I think, and this is just a me thing, you can disagree, but I think when you're teaching it, you kind of have sort of a responsibility to be objective, because like with Oversimplified is probably the biggest historical YouTuber. Every time he uploads, it's an event. And, I know many people who don't even care about history will go and watch Oversimplified video. YouTubers who don't even react to history will go and watch Oversimplified. And for many people, he might be the only person that they ever watch, you get me? And so I know that his stick is kind of to be, more comedic and tell a lot more jokes, but I do feel like he does kind of get to the point and, can be pretty, for the most part, good in relaying some of the basics that might lead people to getting into whatever topic he's talking about. But again, he might be the only, like, historical YouTuber people might get, and that might be the only way they get information. And so, like I said, you can have, like, your opinion, but I think when you're teaching, it's best to kind of drop the pretext, you get me? The biases, the whatever, and maybe try to be objective. That's why I love Kings and Generals. Like, we watched Kings and General Julius Caesar video at the same time we were watching Historia Civilis' Caesar series. And, you know, the biggest example that I love to bring up is that Historia Civilis, you know, painted Julius Caesar as a power-hungry tyrant and who definitely wanted the crown, while Kings and Generals proposed that, but he also showed the other side, that it could have possibly been, you know, other stuff, like with the crowning and whatnot. So I don't know, I kind of like that. I feel like, you know, there should be more objectiveness. And, you know, when I find out a YouTuber isn't, I kind of start like, okay, how much am I hearing that's actually true now? Especially about this. Like, that's why I'm kind of being a lot more careful. And, you know, so if what he is saying is true, now I have to keep saying this now for the rest of the video, if what I'm hearing is, for the most part, true, then that's an interesting situation. But now I'm, like, on guard completely about everything I'm hearing and how much of it is I can take. And I don't really like, it is a pet peeve of mine when I have to go into videos kind of like that. Because I'm like, okay, how much am I hearing, you know, is, you know, alright, and how much isn't. It is just a personal thing that gets me, you know, when I feel like I have to be on guard when I'm listening to some YouTubers. But, oh, well, that's just a me thing. I'm not sure this might upset people or not, but, yeah, I'm very much iffy about what I'm hearing now.
The perspective of Turkey at the periphery is very much mistaken. It is a place that stands at the center between two cultural spheres. However, geography alone does not dictate a nation's success. The geographic determinist likes to look through maps, analyze the geographic features within and around state and stateless constructs, to then try to determine and explain the limitations of these entities or even predict their futures. And Turkey is at the same time one of the favorites, but also one of the biggest counterpoints to the idea of our geographic surroundings shaping who we are and what we do. The geography of Anatolia has without a doubt shaped much of the expansions and limitations of the various entities that came to have control over it. But you will have noticed that we spent almost an entire hour talking about social developments within Turkish society in which close to no foreign entanglements appeared. Despite what many claim is a geography that invites such entanglements to happen. That is because Turkish society, irrespective of its own and surrounding geography, decided to do so. Ataturk demanded an end to foreign entanglements, conquests and influence. The Turks should embrace their new republic at home, stay within the confines of this new republic and not involve themselves in whatever nonsense foreigners were up to. And for almost an entire century that is exactly what the Turks did. With Erdogan taking the lead, that changed. Turkey reconnected with the idea that it stood at the center and not at the periphery, and as such had a role to play in this world, both in the West and in the East. Part of this meant more determined negotiations over European Union membership, which resulted in the AKP joining the conservative bloc of European political parties, known as the Christian Democrats. This, by the way, is not a EU organization, but the general European political institution in which European conservative parties come together to flesh out ideas and cooperation. It also has a left-wing counterpart. Revealing in that regard was when the Austrian news magazine Profil interviewed the vice president of the Justice and Development Party, Murat Mercan, on why his Islamic Conservative Party had joined the club of European Christian conservative parties.
We are all Democrats, and there can be no democracy without secularism. If the Christian Democrats were not secular, they would also not fit in together with us, because the AKP is a secular party. What we share with European conservatives are the values of tradition and family. Those are what all religions have in common, and separates us from social democrats, liberals, and Greens.
Erdogan sought out a common alliance of the religious conservatives, a sort of alliance of the Abrahamic religious conservatives found throughout the world's democracies. And for this purpose he attempted, at least on the surface, to liberalize society. He tolerated what, ironically, his secular and liberal predecessors had not. And one of the reasons for why he could do so was that his movement and the party was free from the ideological restraints of Ataturk's nationalism. That nationalism had demanded one people, one language, one culture under a secular republic. Erdogan embraced the idea of multiple peoples, multiple cultures, and many faiths and many beliefs within a society. In April 2007...
If that is true, I have to keep saying this now, if that is true, and it did go like that, I will say, like, I'm not opposed to that. Like, I mean, obviously, I come from America, and, you know, we're, at least, it's not just America, but, you know, America is very welcoming of all groups and, you know, orientation and whatnot, and, you know, the complete freedom, what you can practice whatever you want, so long as you're not hurting anybody and whatnot. So it doesn't sound like a bad thing to me. It sounds very similar to that, to my place, as it were. So that's not such a bad thing, at least from what I'm hearing. Though I know that obviously there is some things, especially with some Islamic societies, though I think we did cover last few videos. I can't remember if it was the first or the second. You know, with how Turkey's Islamic practices were very different from like the Middle East and onward, where there are some places there that are very zealous and not a lot of room for adaptability in some regards or practices that people can have. So again, if this is true and he's allowing this more wiggle room and this broader net, as it were, it is not a, I can kind of in some respect kind of agree with it, at least in that, though. Well, what really caught my attention was, we talked about the importance of where, you know, Anatolia is in between the West and the East, in this center point, and you know, that this idea that we should get involved in, instead of kind of being more closed off, is another thing that I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Because there are some places that are like, okay, we'll get more involved and do things, and, you know, I keep thinking of like America's endeavors, where there are times it just doesn't work out. So I don't know, it's definitely a new approach if it is going down like this. But I guess we'll see if there's any success with it, though it is different.
Islamist terrorists murdered 2 Turkish and 1 German Christian, he famously confronted what had happened.
We have 36 different cultures, religions, and more identities amongst us, who we all have to respect. There are 6,000 mosques in Europe that are all protected, and we must be able to provide an equal amount, if not even more, safety and security for every single Christian church and Jewish synagogue in our country.
Okay, and like I said, I'm not I'm for the idea of definitely being more welcoming of all people, having that respect of religion, and kind of, you know, though he did specifically mention the Abrahamic religions, which fall under Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, so there definitely is a more heavy emphasis on that he mentioned. But again, like, I'm all for You know, people want to practice whatever, let them, and they shouldn't have to be afraid to. But that's obviously a very much 2025 United States Americans speaking, and this is another place in the world and whatnot. So I'm definitely speaking in my own kind of idea with that freedom, you know.
Ataturk's nationalism saw the different identities in culture, language, and religion as a private matter, relegated to private homes, and forbade the formation of identity-driven politics as something that could challenge the vision of a unified national identity. In that regard, Ataturk's nationalism had more in common with the Middle East that he wished to leave behind than he may have first thought. Throughout many Middle Eastern societies, differences are often stumped into silence by national myths and fictions, demanding a unification under a pretense that eradicates all differences. And Erdogan stood up to that with an alternative, a vision of openness that embraced these differences. It should not be a contradiction to hold a Turkish passport while being a Jewish Armenian, a Christian Arab, or a Muslim Caucasian. The contradictions of the unified nationalist vision is something that Erdogan was himself very much aware of, as his family are the descendants of Muslim Caucasians from the Caucasus who fled to Turkey from the Russian Empire. It is ironic that Erdogan became the first prime minister to permit pride parades to take place in Turkey, the first to allow the Kurdish language to be taught in schools and to be broadcast on radio and TV, the most successful at coming to a peaceful arrangement with the Kurds, the prime minister under whom the Kurds started to participate within the democratic process, though it was under him that Turkish women engaged in the workforce like under no other previous government, and that social norms dictated by tradition started to get eroded by younger generations. Politically, previous governments had seen themselves as agents of progress within the republic, and it is somewhat ironic that what one could call social progress didn't arrive through pushing forward in alignment with a doctrine of progress, but by taking a huge step backward and letting things within society evolve by themselves. More women started wearing the veil under Erdogan in what could be seen as a step backward, but those women were also better educated, increasingly part of the workforce and more politically active and better paid in what could be seen as a large step forward. What developed is what we could see or be described as an Islamic modernity, that the conflict between religion and modernity, which so many Islamists had tried to end with a defeat of modernity, was in the end resolved through Said Nursi's vision of a compromise leading into an Islamic modernity. That the customs, norms, religion, and traditions of the land were no longer an obstacle in the way of achieving a modern society, but part and parcel of the process of creating this modernity. Economically, Erdogan would rely on a class of educated small and big business owners created during the 1980s. With tax cuts and subsidies, he helped Turkish business grow, and with a foreign policy of opening to foreign markets, he helped expand their reach into foreign markets. An export-orientated economy was built selling textiles, fridges, cars, and other machine parts are no longer just vegetables, and not just for domestic markets, but throughout a range of many foreign countries. His favorite domestic economic policy would be one that he had embraced during his time as mayor of Istanbul: infrastructure development, a new bridge across the Bosporus, expanded metro systems, and even subsidies for shopping centers that were seen as an economic infrastructure. The contracts for these were dished out en masse to various construction companies, expanding the already large construction sector. At the same time, Turkey, as a tourism destination, was aggressively promoted throughout Europe, resulting in extensive growth in that sector. Erdogan came closer than any of his predecessors to resolving Turkey's longest conflict as well. He had the Admar Cathedral, the traditional seat of the Armenian Church, renovated and invited Armenian dignitaries to the opening of that cathedral. In 2005, the Turks and Armenians almost normalized relations, but the army, which still had some political power, intervened and stopped that process. His big opening towards the east in foreign policy came in 2004, when Assad was invited to visit Turkey. Syria at the time was an internationally isolated nation. What Erdogan had hoped to achieve with this visit was a normalization of relations to Turkey, but to also help Syria establish itself again within the international community. If successful, Turkey could have presented itself as a partner for nations willing to break out of international isolation. And even though he failed with Assad, it did not stop him from tying Turkey deeper economically and culturally within the Islamic world and the Middle East, like no other Turkish prime minister before him had. In particular, Turkey found interest in the periphery, the often ignored majority Muslim countries to be found on the edges of Africa, which were all very welcoming to new economic ties, investment, and closer cooperation. And this increased in 2006 when both the Germans and French had a change in leadership who both negated the idea of Turkey joining the European Union. Turkey increasingly looked east after this, to new partners and friends within North Africa, Central Asia and the Middle East. However, underlying conflicts and future conflict potential was increasingly brought to the surface. The increasing activity of Turkey within the Middle East resulted in ever greater suspicion over that activity by the Saudis, Iranians, Americans, but especially the Russians. However, not just abroad, but also domestic conflict increasingly boiled up to the surface. In April 2007, the Turkish army posted a statement on the internet declaring that recent political developments, including the election of a religious president, might lead to them to intervene within the politics of the country. And in 2005, Erdogan approved of a bill that strengthened Article 301. This law stems from the time when Ataturk grabbed whatever he could from the law books of European countries. Whatever seemed advanced and in service of modernity was grabbed, including this law, which was basically just copied word for word from the law books of fascist Italy. It criminalized insulting of Turkishness, which could mean basically anything, and that is the point. It's a so-called rubber law, a law designed to be stretched and twisted to be used for whatever the rulers deemed necessary to imprison whoever annoys them. Erdogan's changes were so extreme that this law basically was expanded to make it illegal to critique the foreign policy of the government. The opening of society itself also released political forces that had, for a very long time, been dormant. Hrant Dink was a curious and courageous figure, an Armenian Turk, a political liberal and journalist who ran a small paper in Turkey. He advocated for the normalization of relations between Turkey and Armenia. He demanded an acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide. He harshly criticized nationalism of any sort. He had revealed that Sabiha Gökçen was in fact an Armenian. He published the stories of the remaining Armenian community in Turkey, in both Turkish and Armenian, and he insisted that it was no contradiction to be an Armenian while also being a patriotic Turk, that this republic was a place of many cultures and that Armenian was one of them. He was shot dead by a Turkish far-right Islamist on the streets in front of his office in 2007. Yet his death would reveal substantial change.
Hey boy. For those of you who might be aware of what's going on in America, we actually had a shooting not too long ago. A man known as Charlie Kirk who was killed, and yeah, sorry, that just brought back a memory hole. Oh my goodness. Oh boy. This is definitely you know, I heard things about this guy. There are opinions, and I have yet to fully look into him myself, so I can't say that I stand with any opinion that I've heard, but you know, that one that I came across is that, you know, at first he might have been alright, but then he descended into what some would call tyranny. I don't know. That's the thing though. I'm like wondering with situations like this, especially some modern, I believe he's still active today. Like, is he? Wait, let me see if he's still, like, even kicking. Yeah, he's still alive today. Oh, he has social media, that's cool. So, let's see, he's still active. Is he still... Okay, vice president. In office. Okay, so the point is, I've heard opinions about this man. And the thing is, especially with modern politics, this is where the lines get blurry. And as you guys can tell, I've been kind of very iffy about my word choices and what I'm saying, because I feel like I'm walking on eggshells a lot. But yeah, like what I've heard is that maybe he might have started off more nobly, but then gone down into a more tyrannical, less favorable position. Don't. I would have to look way more into him before I form a solid opinion, though that's what I've heard from other people. And I feel like with modern politics, opinions are, I feel like it's easier to look at people in the past, like politicians, because, some of them are just dead or just not active anymore. So you kind of have a full scope of everything they've done. But it's a bit more tricky when you're talking about someone who's still around and still making any moves, because there's still news about this man going around, as we just saw. So it's a bit iffy, but a part of me is like worried on what position this video is going to take, and how he's going to fully portray it, because I'm imagining there might be opinions on both sides. Maybe some might more agree in line with some of whatever he did, which I'm sure he's going to get into. Some might just go with what opinions I've heard, which are not so favorable towards him. So I'm interested in what position this video is going to take, and if that's bias is going to ring true. Alright, let's keep going. Let's find out.
Changes that had taken place in society and would shape future social conflict to come. His funeral was attended by tens of thousands, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, mostly young, who marched through the streets in protest, shouting the slogans, "We are all Kurds, we are all Armenians, we are all Turks, we are all Hand Dink," in Turkish, in Kurdish, and in Armenian. With the shackles of Ataturk's rigid nationalist vision removed, people asserted their identities and made room for the identities of others. A generation that came to grow up after the last coup would take advantage of the new openness, and a political left that had been dormant for 3 decades would come to challenge the new establishment that Erdogan had become. Should you ever find yourself browsing through popular Turkish music, you will notice that hip-hop is pretty popular in Turkey, but there's also a substantial cultural difference. Whilst in the United States rappers brag about their wealth, flash their jewelry, and show off their expensive cars, the Turkish rap...
Don't forget about the big booty hoes, bro. But... I can't stand modern rap, bro, because it's all the same. And especially I find female rappers are way more graphic, talking about their vaginas and stuff. I'm like, oh my goodness, yeah, I can't stand modern rap. It's very debauched, to put it nicely. Though I will say that, like I said, I mentioned before that last May I went to Europe. I visited France, and then I visited Greece for 2 weeks, and it was interesting hearing the music, because again, here in America, I just mentioned, the modern rap stuff, very sexually driven, very graphic in terms of what we're talking about, but over there, definitely a completely different vibe, which I found interesting. My mom couldn't stand it. I was actually listening to the radio while we were driving, because we rented a car, and I did really kind of I was kind of digging it. I was like, wow, this is very different. And then she couldn't stand it, so she turned it off. But I was kind of vibing. So it is interesting visiting different cultures and hearing what emphasis they put on stuff and their music. I'm kind of a fan of stuff like that. So I'm wondering how Turkish music raps like.
Walks barefoot through the ruins of a broken society, lamenting the inequality and disparity of society.
Oh, wow.
Or if you want to go even more radical, digs mass graves for rich people, as cleaning ladies shoot up the CEOs of a company, a chauffeur strangles a billionaire, abused prostitutes cut the throat of a wealthy John, and waiters poison their rich customers. This might come across as a mere pop culture side note, but in fact is reflective of a wider social problem, one that has been around since the 50s, and which Erdogan couldn't fix but only made worse: the wealth inequality. When Erdogan came to power, the wealthiest 10% of the country owned 67% of the country's wealth, which increased over the next 2 decades to 81%. Meanwhile, the remaining 90% had their share decrease from 32% to 18%. Turkey under Erdogan became an increasingly unequal society. The economy boomed and capital moved into the country, but that capital ended up in fewer hands. And when you look at who these hands belonged to, you will find that it was mainly the hands of construction company owners and bankers, members of the new educated Islamic conservative elite that emerged during the 1980s, of which many have very close political ties to Erdogan. One of Erdogan's favorite economic policies had been gargantuan building projects, be they a new bridge across the Bosporus, a system of highways, new metro systems, or the building of a new Bosporus canal. One particular favorite of his was the promotion of the building of shopping centers and malls all across the country. And most of these projects were built by people close to him, who through these contracts became increasingly wealthy. The smell of corruption started to rise all around him in ways that he couldn't simply wipe away. There's also another note on the shopping malls that started to appear. In her book, Turkey, the Insane and the Melancholy, Eceteme Kuran describes a weird social phenomenon of Turkey during the mid and late 2000s. Poor people, in particular families, would go on family walks, strolling through the shopping malls with their kids to look and gaze upon the variety of goods and products on sale, in a way rejoicing over the better days that they presumed would soon be theirs. The symbols of wealth that became erected within the country did more often than not reflect the actual wealth of the population. There were more jobs, there was more capital, but even though Turkey had become a wealthier society, the Turks didn't become a much wealthier people in general. The average living standard rose, but only a select few had their living standards increase dramatically. At a political rally, Erdogan once bragged about how many fridges were being sold in Turkey since he became prime minister, a statement that was widely mocked in Turkey. "We didn't store milk in hollowed-out trees before you came along," an opposition member remarked. And gradually, over the course of several years, people started noticing the increasing inequality throughout the country, as well as several other things. The Islamic welfare kitchens and food handouts that the Justice and Development Party did, they certainly looked good and made the AKP look like a party that cared dutifully for the poor, but why did they only appear when it was election season and then disappear again? In 2007, several army officers were arrested and tried in the Ergenekon trials that took place until 2012. Several military officers were charged with conspiring to overthrow the state and undermine democracy, something that may have been initially welcomed as the final remnants of authoritarian soldiers being removed from power. But why did so many journalists also get arrested? And how come the journalists critical of Erdogan kept ending up being charged in conspiracy trials? 2007 can be seen as a watershed moment. France and Germany blocked Turkey's EU entry, and as a result, Erdogan proclaimed that his country would be looking east, but also became increasingly authoritarian. The ghosts of Menderes, but also of other authoritarian-style rulers that preceded him, came back to rear their ugly heads. The institutions of the state meant to be impartial were again increasingly used to clamp down on opposition members, shut down the press, spread propaganda, and cover up wrongdoings by the government. Erdogan started falling out with several old political companions and increasingly introduced more conservative and Islamist measures. A 300% alcohol tax, as he denounced the supposed degeneracy of young Turks that went out and partied during the weekends. His rallies became gender segregated, and Islamic virtues increasingly praised as he publicly murmured about the reintroduction of the death penalty. However, Turkey itself had also changed. When Erdogan's Minister for Family Affairs made a public statement about the lacking traditional manliness of modern urban Turkish men, her Twitter feed was bombarded by pictures sent by Turkish gay couples. Urban Turkish society had changed substantially. The poor farm laborers who moved into the cities during the 50s to the 1970s may have been very religious and very conservative. Their children may have also been religious and conservatives, but their children who grew up in this modern urban environment that was well connected into the world, they became increasingly more moderate, liberal, and even left-leaning. A generation in rebellion against an establishment, and the establishment that they grew up.
Yeah, you know, has some similarities to America, actually. Especially as America has become more liberalized and, you know, kind of like some old, like, you often hear about, like, older generations of, like, Americans, like, the, like, 50s and before, definitely being more, you know, Christian, clean-cut, kind of has that image of, like, the 1950s stuff you might have seen, and then, like, from the 60s onwards, definitely, as things dramatically changed, you know, as new generations rise up, even to this day, very, so there is some similarity there. And okay, so I'm kind of starting to see where this video might be going in terms of talking about, wait, with Erdogan, and kind of showing that maybe, like I said, like, I'm a bit iffy about what the general consensus is of the guy and whatnot, if he's actually seen as good or bad by people. I mean, I guess it all depends, as with all politics, and I wonder what, like, modern Turkish people think of all this, but that's kind of the insight I want more, I think, because, you know, you're the one living in Turkey, so I guess you're the one directly affected, unlike me, who's, like, not even in the continent. So there's definitely a lot more ignorance on my part. But, yeah, some things I'm like, you know? You know, there's this YouTuber that I've been watching on my own time, outside of my channel. He's called The Invisible Hand, and I watched a video of his called, Why Living in Greece Has Become Impossible. I really liked it. I kind of looked at a little bit of this other video, Why Living in Turkey Has Become Impossible, and I remember reading some comments, a lot of Turkish people on it, which I found very insightful of what's going down. Like I said, there are some things I'm keeping in track with the world. Like, a while ago, France's political paralysis with its government kind of having a lot of issues, and then the UK riots. So, like, I do kind of watch to kind of like to keep track of, okay, what's going on over here. So, yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, and the Invisible Hands video, like, a lot of Turkish people are commenting, like, oh, I remember when Turkey used to be nice to live in, or like, man, our government's corrupt, and so, you know, again, like, you know, it is interesting what the discourse I keep reading about and hearing, so yeah, very much so. I'm wondering, I can kind of see maybe where this video's going. I don't know, what do you guys think? Like, let me know. I do really enjoy reading. I am fortunate that many of you who do watch my videos do leave very insightful comments. Feel free to let me know, like, some things regarding about the situation. And, you know, I don't know. I'm very interested in reading some thoughts and opinions about all this.
Up under was Erdogan, yesteryear's anti-establishment. Young Turks today are on average less religious, more secular, more open-minded, and more progressive than even some of their European counterparts. Women who don't wear the veil, people who drink, people who have sex before marriage, people who are even open atheists, people willing to question the status quo more publicly than even previous generations had. The demographic change to the political binary of the country started to increasingly even itself out. In 2013, these two social forces crashed into conflict. First, several people close to Erdogan, including government ministers and high-ranking members of Istanbul local governments, were arrested in a large corruption probe. Erdogan viciously lashed out. He fired the police chief of Istanbul. Almost all the police officers involved in the corruption probe were also fired, and he had the prosecutor arrested while blaming a conspiracy of his former political ally, Abdullah Gülen. The prosecutor was later released, but the damage had been done and his public image was greatly diminished. A government-critical newspaper was shut down, and then when a small group of protesters demanded that the Gezi Park of Istanbul should not be changed into yet another shopping mall, he cracked down on that small, peaceful group with extreme police brutality, which resulted in nationwide protests and riots that lasted for months. The secular, liberal, and left-leaning movements of the country, who had been in the socio-political background for decades, suddenly re-emerged into the forefront. From there on, the mask would increasingly slip. Erdogan drifted more and more to the political right. He re-engaged in a policy of hostility towards Armenia. He flared up the conflict with the Kurds again. He would crack down on any and all opposition. He would use political brutality against opposition protests and those who he saw as threatening to Islamic values, be they labor union protests or LGBT rights parades. The result of this is a social conflict unlike in any other place, where traditional Islamic values clash with a modern vision for a society from the West. And in many ways this results in Turkey being a place of stark contradictions like can be seen almost nowhere else in the world. Hande Kader was a Turkish trans woman, trans activist, and sex workers' rights activist. She was one of the leading figures in the riots that resulted when Erdogan attempted to shut down pride parades with police force. In 2016, she was kidnapped, brutally tortured, gang-raped, doused in gasoline and burnt alive.
Oh my goodness.
She became a symbol of a very dark truth in Turkey. That is, that Turkey has the highest murder rate of trans people in the world, and one of the highest murder rates of gays and lesbians in the world. Yet, the large social contradiction is that Turkey is also the only majority Muslim society where people can be openly gay. Turkey is the only Muslim country with an elected lesbian politician. It has the largest and most vibrant gay scene of any Muslim country. A place where gay and lesbian Arabs go to feel free. A place more tolerant and open-minded than even many European countries. Yet it is also a place where for Turkish gays and lesbians, taking advantage of that freedom can be very dangerous. This is a place where women have more freedoms than in any other majority Muslim country. A place where theoretically they should be able to earn and achieve anything. But this is also a country where the First Lady says that all that a woman needs to know they can learn from being in a man's harem. And where most women who achieve any success are those who find that within the limited space that an Islamic conservative-dominated field may permit them to have. It's one of the few Muslim-majority countries with strict laws forbidding domestic violence, yet the domestic violence rates are very high. This is a country where people see themselves as agents of progress aligned with values seen in Europe and North America and allied with an international movement for progress. But those very supposed allies abroad have also abandoned them as they find themselves in conflict with religious virtues that in Europe and North America are defended as minority values. This is a society with a conservative set of beliefs, traditions and social norms wishing to tie deeper into the Middle East, yet at the same time those very same right-leaning political blocs often look down upon the peoples of the Middle East with an almost racist contempt. You can see this social conflict as a confrontation of religion with secularism, tradition with modernity, Islam with modernity, or something else. Whatever you call it depends on your beliefs and political framing of the situation, but the fact remains that even though Turkey also undergoes social upheaval through other sources of division, this underlying social conflict, which has very much been around for almost 2 centuries, still deeply affects the country to this day. With the country increasingly boiling in social conflict, in 2016, sensing their chance, a group of Turkish officers attempted a coup, but they overestimated their chances at success drastically. The Turkish army had at this point in history harmed every group there was in this country. Instead of welcoming the army, the public flooded the streets in protest and stopped them. This was one of the most important moments in recent Turkish history. The army had dominated over this country in the name of its republic's founder to rein in on anyone who would in their view challenge that founder's vision. That domineering shadow was now gone. What remained of the army would now have to be at service to the government. But curiously, despite the coup failing, the post-coup purge came anyway, at the hands of the government. Over the course of the following weeks and months, thousands of not only army officers, but also journalists, politicians and academics who had opposed Erdogan were arrested and put on trial. This galvanized society even more into an uproar. And then Erdogan used the climate of mistrust to push through his greatest change to the country. Constitutions usually take a 2/3 parliamentary majority to be changed, and the country's constitution had dictated that Turkey was a parliamentary republic, meaning that the president was largely a ceremonial figure, and most political powers lay within the parliament. Erdogan overruled the rules and simply scheduled a referendum within a year of the coup, with which he won the powers to change the constitution, making Turkey a presidential republic in which the president, that being him, had almost all executive and political power. This has often been described as the final move into dictatorship. However, it is worth noting that the French Republic is built almost the same way, with a very powerful president. With this new power vested into the office of the presidency, Erdogan had more power than any political figure since Ataturk to reshape the country in his image.
You know what I keep finding a very interesting thing that keeps coming up in this video is how there are the influences of Islam, the Middle East he keeps bringing up, but also similarities to the West that he also keeps bringing up, like with other nations in terms of their practices and what they allow or don't. It seems like, at least the way this video is framing it, is that Turkey is kind of taking aspects from East and West and kind of sort of becoming this amalgamation of various different things, and I think it kind of ties back to the idea in the beginning of Turkey, or Anatolia being between, like I mentioned earlier, the East and the West, sort of taking this influences and ideas from both, and like becoming this like amalgamation of ideas that, yeah, do appear very contradictory, right, with like allowing things, but also at the same time, like with the whole pride stuff, allowing it, but also having a high rate of like, you know, murder and whatnot. So yeah, it's like this contradiction, and I guess that if this video is accurate in that assessment, I have to keep mentioning this, but and it is kind of like that, then it would kind of show, yeah, like how, you know, we often think of the East and the West as two very different worlds, and so combining them, you're gonna have some overlap with, you know, some clashing, rather, of ideas and practices, creating this weird center where some ideas coexist, but also kind of are at odds with each other. That is an interesting idea. If it is accurately being portrayed in this video, then yeah, it is a... I find that aspect's so fascinating so far.
And he could also technically remain president until his death, as long as he kept getting re-elected. And that he did. A presidential system requires strong parties to compete, and with the opposition divided, Erdogan's party is by now still the only party that could rally the votes required to win. However, there is something Erdogan forgot about presidential republics. One thing about France, in which enormous political powers are vested within the office of the president, is that the president is also the single most hated political figure in the country. The reason for this is very simple. The more power a democratically elected leader has, the more he is responsible for when things go wrong.
Exactly. Like we talked about with the absolute monarch and the idea that when you're in charge, you get all the glory or all the blame. Like if people view you as the head of something, right? And I think we talked about that, like Tsar Nicholas, the last Tsar of Russia, who wanted absolute power in so much, to be the head and the face of everything. And so when things went south, like with World War I, yeah, everyone looked at him like, you screwed it up. Like, you either get all the glory or all the blame. Like, it all falls on you. That's kind of the biggest problem when you're in charge, as it were, and you have the power, is that when things go south, even if it may or may not have always been you, people will blame you. So that's always kind of the edge of the other edge of the sword, rather. That falls with stuff like this, right?
And when things go wrong in France, as they often do, the people of France put the blame on the one person who has the most power. Turning Turkey into a presidential republic with many powers vested into the office of the president made Erdogan more powerful, but it also made him more unpopular over time. With all the increased responsibility, it was him who Turks increasingly held to account when things went wrong. With Erdogan shifting into more right-wing and Islamist positions, the political field started to change again. Erdogan allied himself with the far-right MHP, however, with some unintended consequences. In late 2019, Erdogan announced he intended to add changes to the country's laws on rape and sexual assault based on Sharia. Under Sharia, the punishment for rape is that the rapist is forced to marry his victim. You might just say that this is really just punishment for the victim, but women's rights aren't exactly something people cared about in the 7th century. But women today do care about their rights. So the result of this political move were widespread protests by women, and also that all women members left the MHP after it approved of Erdogan's suggestion, forming a new far-right party of mostly secular women. The field of opposition to Erdogan is large. It includes a Kurdish Liberal Party, the Workers' Socialist Party, and the newly reformed Republican Party. The political field in Turkey is also drastically changing. A new generation of urban youths lean more to the left wing. There's now a secular far right, and curiously enough, after decades of voting for the far right and Islamists without their lives improving much as a result, poor farmers in the very east of Anatolia started voting communist. What all these opposition parties share in common, however, is that they wish to have a return to the old parliamentary system of the republic and away from the presidential republican system. And if that will happen or not is yet to be seen. In 2019, Erdogan had his biggest defeat yet when his party lost the mayoral elections in his home city and the AKP bastion of Istanbul. Enraged by the results, he ordered another election, claiming there had been election fraud. However, that backfired drastically. Annoyed with being called to vote again, the people of Istanbul voted for the Republican candidate. However, Erdogan is still widely popular despite losing his home city, especially in the countryside. So it is hard to tell where this country will be going next in its elections throughout the next years.
Wow.
It is difficult to figure out who first coined the term Neo-Ottomanism. One claim is that the term was first used by Erdogan's foreign minister Ahmet Davutoglu when jokingly describing his government's foreign policy. The other claim is that the word first appeared when Iran complained about the increasing Turkish influence in the Middle East. The term itself is hyperbolic and threatening, so I find it more likely that it came from those who might be suspicious of the ever-growing Turkish geopolitical power. And it has an admittedly somewhat threatening aura to it. It probably elicits the same reaction to most as the term Japanese neo-imperialism does to Koreans. The frowning face Indians may pull when English people speak of the empire in glowing nostalgic terms. Colonial legacies endure, and when you Google neo-Ottomanism, you will find this clip amongst the first top results.
Bakınız bugün biz Suriye deyince, Irak deyince, Kırım deyince, Batı Trakya deyince, Bosna deyince birileri sanki uzaydan gelmiş gibi yüzümüze bakıyor. Hatta daha da ileri gidip tam bir cahil cesaretiyle Türkiye'nin Irak'la ilişkisi ne olabilir? Bosna'yla ilişkisi ne olabilir diyebiliyorlar. Halbuki bugün başka dünyalardan bahseder gibi sözünü ettiğimiz bu coğrafyalar bizim canımızın birer parçasıdır. Gaziantep'le Halep'i, Rize'yle Batum'u, Edirne'yle Gümülcine'yi, Kırcaali'yi, Bursa'yla Üsküp'ü birbirinden farklı düşünmek mümkün mü? Evet, bu şehirler fiziki olarak başka ülkelerin sınırları içindedir. Ama bizim gönül sınırlarımız oraları kapsayacak şekilde geniştir.
But the Ottoman Empire is gone, and the term is, if we are being honest, very exaggerated. The Ottomans are not going to rise from their graves to reconquer an empire, and the reality of the matter is that this term is simply used to describe something for which we have no other name, because it is something that hasn't happened since the Ottomans existed. A Turkish state that, as the 2000s started, is reasserting itself from the international stage. Let's take a step back, shall we? This series of videos was initially meant to only be 20 minutes long and to cover this specific part only. But I decided differently, because I want all of you watching this to take away something important, namely that there is no simple reason for why geopolitical and historic events occur. Historic events always happen within a wider context of other events, some of which may have occurred centuries before the current ones. Take a different perspective. To younger generations, Turkey asserting itself internationally is a break from the norm, since Turkey has spent the last 100 years avoiding that. But take the perspective from a further generation stepped back, and you might reconsider, aren't the past 100 years of the Kemalist Republic possibly the actual exception? Most of this video was spent mainly talking about the developments that occurred within Turkish society itself, and even though sometimes outsiders influenced events within Turkey itself, and Turkey may have joined global trends in policy on occasion, the truth of the matter is that Turkey spent most of the 20th century deliberately not involving itself in foreign affairs. And there's a good reason for this. Ataturk wanted it. His vision was for a Turkish homeland, for the Turkish people, neutral and uninvolved in any foreign power struggles. When the Republic was founded, it came at a time when the age of empires seemed to be coming to an end. A new century was on the horizon with new and different power dynamics, an age of ideologies and not of empires. And Ataturk's founding vision was adhered to for most of the Republic's history. In terms of geography, the Turkish Republic had all the same advantages which the Ottomans have had. To the north, the coastlines of the Black Sea are far away from any other centers of power and therefore inviting to seek out influence over. In the west, the mountain ranges of the Balkans naturally push their inhabitants into an Anatolian sphere of influence. And since the Danube flows into the Black Sea, all those nations reliant upon it for access to the sea fall into a Turkish sphere of influence. There's a reason why the Austrians, whose prime means of large-scale transportation was the Danube, kept fighting the Ottomans along the Danube until they had access to the Adriatic. To the south, most of what borders the Turks is just flatlands, with the added benefit that Turkey owns the origin of the two most important navigable rivers in the Middle East. So for most, Turkey could just roll into the Middle East with very little in the way to stop it. Pretty much the only place it can't go is east, where Iran is protected by the vast Zagros mountain range. However, for most of the 20th century, that did not matter. Communism held a firm grip over the north and west, and the Turkish attitude to the south was what you would expect from the unceremonious divorce that had happened at the beginning of the century. With the end of communism, but more with the ascent of Erdogan, all of that changed. And the first indication the world got of a Turkey taking interest in matters outside of her own borders was when Serbia massacred its way through Bosnia. The Turks threatened military intervention against the Serbs if the Americans wouldn't do something. This was received as a surprise, but also as a threat to some. It meant that the Turks were asserting themselves in a foreign region, a region that had once been part of the Ottoman Empire, and doing so in a manner that signaled that they saw this part of the world, namely the Balkans, as their sphere of influence. Simplistic minds who claim that this is a Muslim expansion are however wrong, because barely over a decade after the Turks threatened the Serbs with war, the Turkish president was welcomed in Serbia with fanfare and celebration as a friend of the country. Turkey and its influence is in fact ironically welcomed in Serbia as a result of the Balkan War. Because as a result of the Serbian genocidal shenanigans during the Balkan War, Europeans were so embarrassed by their inaction that they consistently blocked Serbia from joining their club. This left Serbia in a vacuum that Turkey took advantage of, which shows us first and foremost that the Turkish government in recent decades has been very capable of driving a foreign policy of expanding influence, not on the basis of some ideological or religious dogma, but on the basis of pragmatism and seizing opportunities. The Balkans were, by most, seen as a poorhouse or as a poor lunatic asylum, especially by Europe. If you live here, you may have yourself read the tabloid fearmongering about thieving Serbs, creepy Croats, and sleazy Romanians. There was a widespread European attitude of, by and large, leaving the place to itself, which the Turks used to move in to build economic spheres of influence. Political influence is, however, limited. No Balkan country will ever act on behalf of Turkey, and most of the Balkans still look towards the European Union. But Turkey's economic influence is noted. Even though it may not result in direct political power, it does result in soft power. It isn't lost on outsiders that the $2 billion of Turkish investment into Bulgaria and $7 billion in Turkish investment in Romania are both in EU member countries, something that Turkey could use as a bargaining chip to make its EU membership more likely, especially if Romania and Bulgaria cannot be integrated within the common European market. This is why many interest groups have in recent years moved to counteract such influence. A direct railroad connection from Vienna to Bucharest was recently opened, a project mostly built by the Austrians in hope of making the Carpathian mountain barrier a little less limiting for Romanians and to tie them deeper into the European economies. The French and Germans engaged in massive economic investment into Romania. If you ever wondered why so many people here in Europe drive Dacias, it's because the French bought that Romanian car manufacturer and hope to use it to tie Romania deeper into Europe. This struggle over economic influence in the Balkans goes further than you may think, but more on that later. Let's for now return and go south again. Throughout most of the 20th century, Arabs held a very negative view of Turks and vice versa. The Arabs saw the Turks as colonizers who had plundered their lands, butchered their people, and left them in ruins. The Turks, for their part, mostly saw Arabs as backward and stuck in the past, shackled by religious superstition and unable to advance into modernity. However, as the century came to a close, attitudes started to change. As a generation of Turks became more religious, their views that the Middle East was one of a place they wished to culturally reconnect with. And to the Arabs, Turkey seemed to look more prestigious as time went by, a comparably wealthy country. But that wealth was not the result of conveniently sitting on a large pile of oil, but out of work and industry and innovation. The only Muslim country to ever defeat Western countries in open war. A majority Muslim country that was respected and seen on equal standing with European powers. Since the collapse of the Caliphate, there has not been a majority Muslim state or other entity in the world that could proclaim to be the representative of Muslims in the world, or carry a prestigious role in the name of the Muslims of the world. Some tried, all failed. Technically speaking, this wasn't even true of the last Caliphate, as it constantly bickered and fought with other Muslim states. But nonetheless, with the increasing rise of Islamism and with the failure of socialism and nationalism throughout the Arab world, leaving a societal gap for Islam to claim a role of being a unifier across cultural boundaries, the desire to find a unified Muslim voice, or someone who was willing to speak for the world's Muslims, grew, and that role is something that Turkey under Erdogan has in recent years increasingly tried to slip into. Erdogan took on the mantle of being the protector and guardian of Muslims around the globe, no matter if they were Shia, Sunni or other. He increasingly berated Israel over Palestine, picked fights with India over its...
Alrighty, so yeah, if that is accurate, then dang. It kind of reminds me when Russia looked at the Ottomans and were like, we're now the protector of all Christians in your empire. It's just like they just decided that, and it's like, alright, like, you know, the Ottomans were on decline, so it went down. But if Turkey really has taken that approach, then dang, that's yeah, it would kind of prop them up to be like the next, like, yeah, face of leading force of Islam. And considering their successes, like when, you know, after World War I, and, you know, defeating the Western forces, and that makes sense. If it is going down like that as the video is claiming, then yeah.
Treatment of Muslims, continuously confronts Europe over its treatments of Muslim communities, vocally condemns Burma over its treatment of the Rohingya, constantly criticizes Russia over its treatment of Muslim minorities, and is one of the few countries who publicly condemns China over its treatment of the Uyghurs. The latter is especially relevant. There are over 1 million Uyghur Muslims locked in gulags and mistreated in Western China, and all Muslim countries in the world remain silent. All of them do not wish to sour their relationship with China, all except for one, and that does not go unnoticed by Muslims across the world. And it works. Turkey is, especially amongst Muslim communities and majority non-Muslim societies, seen as the country that will stand up for them. If you ever wondered why the United States had a member of Congress who denies the Armenian genocide, it is because of an increasingly well-connected network that Erdogan has been building, a vision of a unified Islamic political bloc around the world. But looks can also be deceiving, and there certainly are more motivations to this than just religious. Turkey is at odds with India over influence in Central Asia, where both Turkey and India compete over geopolitical influence. Turkey bullies Europe on whatever standard it can, not just out of religious motivation, but to point out hypocrisies in denied EU membership. Turkey is angry with Israel not just because of the Palestinian conflict, but because it started building deeper military ties with Greece. Turkey would like to have more influence over the Muslim-populated regions of Russia closer tied to its border. And Turkey is one of the few countries that can bully China because of conflicting geopolitical interests along China's new Silk Road project. All of the supposed concerns over the treatments of Muslims in the world happen to conveniently coincide with Turkish geopolitical ambitions and conflicts. It is therefore hard to tell if the proclamations of being the protectors and leaders of Muslims in the world are sincere or just a facade to hide the true political ambitions behind them. Is Turkey under Erdogan really trying to be a leader of the Muslim world, or is that just a nice banner to hide the building of regional power? Foreign powers do, however, seem to take it increasingly seriously. China, for one, dependent on access to the Mediterranean for its new Silk Road project, is publicly floating the idea of building a canal from Belgrade to Thessaloniki, which would connect the Danube to the Mediterranean. This project would be great for Serbia, Northern Macedonia, Hungary, Greece, and Austria, who would be set to gain enormously from it. But everyone knows that China isn't considering this out of the kindness of their hearts, but because the canal would also significantly cut down on Turkey's geopolitical influence over the Balkans.
Wow.
Within the Middle East, however, Turkey is building its influence by different means. It is increasingly investing in countries just like in Europe, but unlike in Europe, Erdogan is actively promoting the system by which he rules as an alternative to the current rulers of the Middle East, from Egypt to Iraq. The main power struggle of the Middle East that we tend to fixate on in the news is between Saudi Arabia and Iran, both continuously destabilizing each other and each other's allies for intricate networks of propped-up militias, each fighting the other to leave behind a bombed-out terrorized husk of a society in its wake. A process that intensifies with the increasing US withdrawal from the region, and within this conflict for dominance between the two, Turkey seems to be the third player, the dark horse that everyone is ignoring. Iraq has been torn apart by years of conflict, and when you turn on the news you will hear of Shia militias, Sunni terror groups, and US drone strikes. But there is one thing you won't see: the increasingly tightly knit economic ties to Turkey, even embracing Iraqi Kurdistan as a reliable business partner and source for oil. In essence, one could almost say that in that region of the Middle East, the Turks just sit back, watch the Saudis and Iranians kill each other and terrorize the locals, and to then move in and instead of offering to arm just another militia, offer investment, jobs and financial aid in exchange for deepening ties with Turkey, playing a long and patient game instead of the often erratic and impulsive actions that others in the region tend to engage in. The greatest challenge to the current status quo in the Middle East through Turkey came when the Turks occupied large swaths of northern Syria in the wake of a US retreat. Officially, Erdogan claimed this was to resettle Arab refugees who the Turks themselves were becoming tired of. And as true as that may be, it is however rather obvious that this was done to finally get revenge against and wipe out the Kurdish strongholds in northern Syria. But more striking is how this is a direct challenge to the status quo throughout the Arab world, a world in which the previous century has been dominated by the question of which principles to build a society around. And in that world, Erdogan seized a small parcel of land to build an Arab society under his supervision, a society that is likely intended to be a showcase to the Arabs of what their homes and lives could be in a Middle East where Turkey is the main geopolitical power. Increasingly, Turkey flexes its muscle in the region, be it through limiting fresh water supplies to the Middle East with its dams, or by flexing its muscle militarily. That military muscle is also very significant because technically Turkey is one of the few countries in the region that actually has a well-trained army. The Iranian army specializes in insurgency tactics, and the Saudi army is a laughingstock. Turkey is one of the few countries in the region that really has a significant fighting force. However, it is in Syria where Turkey is taking its first steps to build regional power that it also encountered its biggest roadblock to that increase of power. An old enemy. Ironically, as Turkey started building regional power in the Middle East, the one thing standing in its way was neither Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, or the United States. It's Russia. Did you know that there's a civil war going on in Libya? You might have forgotten. You probably don't know who the fighting factions are. But there is something that I bet will surprise you. It's a proxy war between Russia and Turkey. Both support opposite sides and both seek to gain influence over the country. Russia has been Turkey's greatest obstacle in the Middle East so far. It competes with Turkey over influence in Egypt. It ruined Turkey's plans for a post-Assad Syria, is increasingly propping up Iran, and is fighting the before-mentioned proxy war in Libya. Wherever Russia can hinder an increased build-up of Turkish influence...
Alright, so if this is accurate and how it's being portrayed, it's kind of funny because when we think of like the Ottoman Empire and just how much Russia would always fight them, they had so many wars in that rivalry. It would be kind of funny if that rivalry is still going on. Like, frickin' it never ended. Russia is still battling the Turks. That's kind of very interesting, you know, if it's still going on as he's proposing.
Does what it can, and wherever Turkey can hinder an increasing Russian influence in the Middle East, it also does what it can. Both countries seem to be interested in building new spheres of influence in the Middle East as other powers are increasingly pulling out, and as such, they both compete. But curiously, while all this is still going on, Turkey negotiated an alliance with Russia. The funniest alliance that currently exists in the world between two countries that are actively trying to undermine each other with proxies. The alliance solely exists to pressure common opponents such as the Kurds and Saudis, and for Turkey to scare the US under its current weak leadership to not stop supporting it. So while other powers competing over influence are tearing each other apart, both Russia and Turkey, at least officially, agreed to not get in each other's way. For now. Because every observer knows that this is an alliance that will end sooner rather than later with one of the two backstabbing the other. The question only is, who will stab first? However, we should not forget that there is also large-scale public opposition to Turkish involvement in foreign matters domestically. There have been brawls in the Turkish parliament, riots on the streets, protests, and vicious political exchanges over Turkey's increasing involvement abroad. Many Turks, even if they are not in 100% agreement with everything Ataturk did, or even disagree with him entirely, still believe that he was right about one thing in particular: that Turkey should stay out of foreign wars. Turks may like the idea of their country being more important on the international stage, of its word carrying more weight abroad, but many draw the line at seeing Turkish soldiers on foreign soil. This political debate is one of the most heated in Turkey right now and often overlooked by foreigners. It especially flared up in recent years when some of the Turkish soldiers sent across the border into Syria came home in coffins. However, the vacuum of power in the Middle East, the beneficial geography, and the threat of Russia all combined seem too tempting for Turkey to not seek out more influence in the region. No matter which prime minister may be elected, it is very much doubtful that Turkey would simply stop seeking out and expanding its influence over the Middle East if Erdogan is pushed out of power. It is therefore more likely than not that you will be hearing more of Turkey as it becomes more prominent in the Middle East as the years go by. When looking at the past millennia, one could almost see the past century as a mere
Yeah, so Turkey's involvement in the Middle East, if this video is accurately portraying that, is very interesting. And it's not something you hear a lot about, actually. Like, I've never really heard of any ambitions from Turkey to keep going more into the Middle East and whatnot, and their stance as, you know, protecting, Muslim/Islam around the world. So, yeah, that's completely new to me. I've never heard of that. And how they're getting involved, so that's probably the biggest revelation I've gotten so far from this video. If it is accurate, so interesting.
Self-imposed break by the Turks to restructure themselves in a post-Ottoman world. Centuries spent in expansion and innovation interrupted by a break to adapt into a modern world. Modern Turkey is a democratic society or an unstable republic. Which one of these depends on your perspective? You can see it as one of the freest, if not the freest society of the Middle East, or as one of the least stable democracies of Europe. It stands at the crossroads of two continental and multiple cultural spheres within a geography that centuries of social upheaval and change could not alter the importance of. The story of how it came to be is unique in this world. It is the story of a journey of a people from one end of the largest mass of land to another, of two empires, of a revolution whose impact on the Middle East cannot yet be measured. Turkey is a country that you will be hearing more of in the near future, as it leaves its self-imposed isolationism of the past century behind to seek out influence within the wider Mediterranean. If that is good or bad is for you to decide. It will be building wider influence in the Middle East and probably try to reshape Arab societies in its own image. And for all we know, it will have a role to play in Europe as well. With this video, I hope to achieve giving you a basic background information set to interpret yourself. I sincerely hope it worked. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so I think that's the end of the main video. It seems like the rest is ads, right? Let's see, wait.
If you wish to support my channel, the books which were used...
Okay, yeah. So he's giving some of the more... So that's the end of the main video. Like I said, I do apologize with some of my more cautiousness this video. And, I kept saying if it is being accurate because, like I said, it is a big thing with me. Sometimes I get unhappy when I find out that I have to be more cautious because I do try to go into these very open, very, giving a lot of trust towards whatever YouTuber I'm listening to, but finding out there's a lot of bias and that it might skewer the way facts are being presented. It does kind of like ruffle my feathers a little. Not to say that, I don't like these videos. I do. It's just, kind of like with the Historia Civilis thing. I enjoy watching Historia Civilis as I enjoyed watching these videos. It's just definitely now I'm on cautious alert as it were. And very like like I said, I think like whenever presenting stuff like and you're teaching it's best to be, you know, more objective. That's what I believe that, you know, people, educational YouTubers should be like. Try to get some of your own biases and whatnot out of the way and just try to show everything and let your viewers come to their own conclusions. With that said, you know, that's why the last two videos, which I mentioned before, I recorded like months ago, I was just taking everything at face value, you know, I was giving that trust, and now this one, I'm like, okay, let's see. I'm like, iffy, it was more quiet, and definitely more careful, at least trying to be more careful, because again, this is modern politics, and, you know, it is a hot topic, to put it nicely. That's why I usually try to avoid modern stuff, but I don't like leaving a series undone, guys, so I needed to. I don't know, I'm definitely gonna have to look more into it, and I'll see whatever opinions I come up with on my own at the end. I will say, if there is, to put aside some of that more critiques I personally have, or my feelings about that, I will say that it definitely was, I think, informative, at least, you know, and definitely well researched. Like I said, this was a monumental task, these many hours that, you know, he put into these videos, and for that I must commend him. And again, I'm not like opposed to watching more if he gets recommended ever again. It's just now I'm kind of put him in the same category as I put Historia Sevilla. It's definitely gonna be a bit careful in what I'm listening to, but overall, yeah, I still really did enjoy this series. It was nice looking into Anatolia and what's going on in Turkey, because like I said, I've had a growing fascination for Anatolia, especially as that kind of really grew this year as we've covered the Byzantines a lot. So, and even in my own time, I've been kind of Googling like maps about Anatolia and like the different, how life was under different, you know, empires and governments. So overall, this was really cool to see. And I'm hoping to look more into Anatolia and what's going on more in the future. So, yeah, I'm gonna end the video right here because I need to get to posting this. And, yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow when we do something else. Bye, everyone.